Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Louisiana Bayou. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1908, and the waters of Terrebonne Parish ran unusually low that spring. Cypress roots jutted out like skeletal fingers, and the air clung thick with the scent of rot and mud. On the narrow road that wound toward a weathered homestead near Bayou du Fort, travelers often paused to stare. The house was 2 stories of decaying clapboard, its roof sagging, its shutters sealed with warped nails. Locals called it La Maison de la Veuve, the widow's house, though few could recall when she had last shown her face in town. Her name in the old county deeds appears as Mrs. Eulalie Devrox Nae Carrere, a woman of middle age, said to have come from Plaquemine after the fever years of the 1890s. The parish records note 3 marriages between 1894 and 1907, each husband vanishing after less than 2 years of union. Sheriff's men recorded the absences as presumed abandonment, but the pattern caught the whispers of those who lived nearest the marshes. One storekeeper, Auguste Lafont, remembered her distinctly. She'd come in late, never by daylight. Paid always in coins, clean as new mint, though her hands were black with garden soil. The region's newspapers were too small to keep detailed files, but a faded clipping from the Thibodaux Sentinel dated March 12, 1908, mentions unusual odors and digging at the Devrox place, reported by itinerant fishermen. That same week, a traveling pastor named Rev. Colin Price was said to have visited her home on account of spiritual disturbance and complaint of voices. His journal, preserved decades later in the Louisiana State Library, includes a single entry under that date. Her cellar is deeper than it should be, dug far into the earth and lined in brick. She said it was for keeping roots cool, but no cellar should breathe as that one does. At the time, Louisiana was still recovering from the social disarray that had followed Reconstruction and the violent storms of 1906. Law enforcement was loose, missing men were often written off as drifters. Yet, even among such uncertainties, Eulalie's name carried unease. A reference from a later investigator, writing after the infamous axemen of New Orleans murders, claimed that Bayou du Fort had its own ghost long before the axe. According to testimony taken from 2 nearby households, the widow Devrox had lately taken to burning her trash at night, long after the frogs fell silent. Thick smoke rose, laced with something acrid. One neighbor, Mrs. Corinne Baudrox, said she saw Eulalie dragging heavy burlap sacks from her cellar door to the pit behind the cypress grove. "I heard the wet sound," she told a parish clerk, "like when you pull a stump from a bog." Despite these murmurs, no one dared confront her. There were stories of sicknesses that followed those who trespassed, of animals gone missing from barns near her land. Even the mailmen left parcels at the gate, never approaching the porch. Then came the discovery, not of a body, but of something stranger. In early May of 1908, the bay's water receded enough to expose the edge of her property line. A boy named Etienne, out catching frogs, found a wooden hatch sunk halfway in mud, its iron ring nearly rusted away. The sheriff was called, reluctantly. By dusk, they would pry open that hatch and face the stale air that had been sealed below for years. And that's where the first official record of the Devrox cellar begins. Entered by Deputy Marshal Alphonse Hebert in ink faded by humidity and time. When Deputy Marshal Alphonse Hebert arrived at the Devrox property, he brought with him 2 field hands, a lantern, and a reluctance he never bothered to hide. The hatch lay partly sunken in the muck, half camouflaged by reeds and creeping vines. Hebert's official note from May 6, 1908, reads with the stiff rhythm of a man trying to sound braver than he felt. "The hatch is not new, nor old. The hinges greased, though no hand seems to have tended them. When opened, there was a cool exhalation, as if the bayou itself were breathing from below. Inside, they found a short stairway descending perhaps 12 feet. The air was heavy, wet with decay, and something sweet like overripe fruit. The lantern light fell on rows of glass jars, hundreds of them, lined along brick shelves. At first glance, they thought them filled with roots, preserves, perhaps the pickled pears she had sold at market years ago. But in the lamplight the contents moved, fragments, pale and shifting, fingers, perhaps, or fish bones. Hebert wrote that one jar contained a shape resembling a human ear, flattened and bleached as parchment. Mrs. Devrox was not at home when they entered. The house above stood silent, the parlor thick with dust, the table set for one. On a dresser they found framed photographs, men, each wearing a black cravat, each different. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in lace, were 3 gold bands. By nightfall, the widow returned. Witness accounts differ on how she looked. One says her dress was damp to the knees, as though she'd been waiting. Another claimed her face carried a calmness, unfit for a woman seeing her home invaded. What is agreed upon is that she said very little. When Hebert demanded explanation, she replied only, "They're resting where they asked to be." She was taken into custody that same evening and transported to the parish jail in Homa. Yet, before dawn, she was gone. The iron lock on her cell was found intact, the straw cot undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading to the wall, where no exit existed. The Lord remove her by his own means, the jailer, old Francois Meyer, wrote later in a letter to the sheriff. No other sense can be made of it. What followed was confusion and a flood of rumors that no authority could untangle. Some said she drowned herself in the Bayou that night, others that she took to the swamps under another name. The official inquiry stalled. The coroner, Dr. Harlan Betchett, refused to pronounce death without a body. He did, however, catalog what was found in that cellar among the jars: 2 partial skeletons, a man's boot with the initials J.D. pressed into the leather, and a rosary wound twice around a jawbone. Years later, when Louisiana newspapers covered the unsolved Axemen of New Orleans killings, one columnist would recall the widow of Bayou Dufour as a prelude to that terror, a woman who, like the Axemen, left behind only evidence of ritual and fear. It is said that her name was briefly included in a 1911 article on local legends, then redacted when descendants protested. But in 1908, the matter remained grimly open. Sheriff Doucet ordered the Devrox house sealed and the cellar filled. Men brought wagons of clay and lime from the levee, pouring it over the hatch until no trace remained. The deputy noted that the earth kept sinking for 3 days after, as though swallowing what they had tried to bury. Still, a few neighbors refused to believe she was gone. They claimed to hear humming near the cypress grove at night. A woman's voice, low and steady, weaving the same French lullaby that had once drifted from her porch. Those who lingered too long swore the tune seemed to come from beneath their feet. The following weeks after Eulalie Devrox's disappearance brought a strange quiet over Bayou Dufour. The marsh, usually alive with the croak of bullfrogs and the splash of garfish, seemed to fall mute. Local men said the air itself grew heavier, as though the Bayou were holding its breath. Sheriff Doucet, a man of practical mind, tried to move the matter along, declaring the case closed pending recovery of remains. But the townspeople did not forget. They rarely do in Louisiana, where stories cling to the air longer than fog. The house stood abandoned, its shutters nailed and the cellar sealed under mounds of lime. Yet, by June, word spread of trespassers, boys from the next parish who dared each other to climb the fence at dusk. What they found was not the widow, but something she'd left behind. According to their later statements, there were prints in the soft earth behind the house, barefoot, small, and oddly deep, as though pressed by someone carrying great weight. It was around this time that the parish records show a curious entry: complaint of odor at the Devrox property. Sheriff advised no further digging. The same line repeats 3 times between June and August of 1908. Each note is unsigned. One deputy, interviewed years later by a traveling reporter, claimed the ground sweated, that on humid days the soil around the old hatch would bubble faintly, releasing a sweet, sickly smell. He left the force the following year. Newspapers in Homa and Thibodaux printed small notices, never front-page stories, just side columns about local disturbances. Perhaps out of fear of reviving panic, still whispers continued. Reverend Price, the same pastor who had written of the breathing cellar, returned to the parish that autumn to lead a small gathering at the church. His sermon from that evening survives in the archives. The ground here remembers. It does not forget its tenets. When the living fail to mark the graves, the earth itself bears witness. By 1909, what remained of the de Vrioch's property was reclaimed by the Bayou. The clay and lime sank deeper, the foundation tilted, and reeds grew through the porch floor. Hunters reported lights under the waterline at night, soft glows like lanterns swinging beneath the surface. No one investigated. Then, in 1911, a drifter named Julien Dessette was arrested in Baton Rouge for attempting to sell gold bands at a pawn shop. One of them matched the inscription recorded from the de Vrioch's case. To Eulalie, my eternal. Under questioning, Doucette claimed he'd found them in a chest half buried near Bayou du Fort. The chest, he said, was wrapped in oilcloth and bone. Authorities dismissed his story as swamp madness, yet the coincidence was enough to reopen old curiosity. Around that same year, reports of a murderer stalking New Orleans made headlines. The one later called the Axeman, a figure whose attacks seemed to follow no logic but terror itself. Journalists at the time drew grim parallels. Both the Axeman and the widow were phantoms of the Louisiana dark, leaving behind evidence of ritual and bodies mutilated beyond explanation. One article in the Daily Picayune even wondered if the widow had survived, changed her name, and moved upriver. It was dismissed as sensationalism, but the public fascination stuck. Back in Terrebonne Parish, older residents began to speak of her as if she had never left. Fishermen would cross themselves when passing her old property, and mothers warned their children not to play near the water after sunset. Some said that when the wind blew from the south, you could hear a faint knocking beneath the reeds, like a door shifting under the soil, or a hand still waiting to be let out. By 1912, the case of the widow de Vrioch's had receded into local folklore, half remembered, often misquoted, and dismissed by the younger generation as superstition. But among the few surviving officials who'd set foot in that house, the memory refused to fade. Deputy Hebert, the man who first opened the cellar hatch, had since retired to Lafourche Parish. In a letter written to his nephew, dated September 3, 1912, he confessed, "I have dreams of that cellar. Sometimes I see it filled again, not with jars, but with water. Faces look up at me through it, still and wide-eyed, like they're under glass." No one in the parish archive can confirm if Hebert's letter was ever mailed. It was found decades later, tucked inside a parish ledger that had been misplaced during a courthouse fire. The handwriting trembles toward the end, ink smudged as if by damp fingers. Around this same time, a small team from New Orleans University, students of natural science, made an excursion to study water levels and soil composition in the Terrebonne marshes. Their records, preserved in the Southern Geological Review of 1913, mention a peculiar discovery near the ruins of an abandoned homestead, now overgrown, reportedly once belonging to a family of French settlers. They note finding brick structures below the silt, aligned with unusual precision, extending deeper than expected for the era. The leader of that expedition, Professor Leon Marchand, later wrote privately to a colleague, "We found what seemed the edge of a cellar wall, but deeper than any resident's foundation would require. The air trapped below had a distinct scent of iron and decay. I advised my team to leave it sealed. It's one of the rare external confirmations that the de Vrioch's site existed at all, an echo that keeps the story tethered to the physical world." Much like how the later axemen of New Orleans murders reminded Louisianans that human monstrosity often hides beneath polite facades. Both tales, though decades apart, share a peculiar familiarity, an unseen figure, vanishing without trace, leaving behind the terror of incomplete evidence. Locals of Bayou du Fort held their own explanations. Some said Eulalie had been a traiteuse, a healer, or something darker. They claimed she preserved pieces of her husband's not out of cruelty but devotion, keeping fragments so their spirits would not wander. Others insisted she'd simply gone mad after the death of her third husband, John Devriox, a carpenter who'd suffered a head wound in the hurricane of 1906. His disappearance, they said, broke her mind. But even those sympathetic versions couldn't erase the unease surrounding her land. There were sightings, too. A ferryman named Louis Ardoin swore that in the summer of 1914, while guiding a lantern boat near Dufour Creek, he saw a woman standing ankle-deep in the water. She was dressed for church, he told a reporter. White gloves, veil, the whole thing. But she had no reflection in the water. None at all. His story ran briefly in the Opelousas Courier, categorized under strange local tales. Ardoin died less than a month later, bitten by a cottonmouth while tying his skiff. By 1915, the old Devriox property was little more than a mound under the cypress shade. The roof had collapsed, and the earth had swallowed the porch whole. Hunters said their dogs refused to approach it. The animals would whine and circle wide through the reeds. No official records mention any second excavation, though one unsigned report in the parish file, dated that same year, includes only 4 words: sinkhole open near house. And beneath that, faintly penciled in the margin, voices heard again. The 1915 parish note, voices heard again, might have been dismissed as a clerk's joke, had it not coincided with a series of reports from trappers and oil surveyors working near the same stretch of Bayou Dufour. Over a 6-month period, at least 4 men mentioned hollow sounds, rising from the marsh, sometimes rhythmic, like the distant thud of a hammer, other times faint murmurs, as if someone were talking beneath the ground. Among the surviving testimonies, the most detailed comes from a man named Caleb Montrose, a surveyor from Baton Rouge. His written statement, now stored in the Terrebonne Parish archives, recounts an evening in September of 1915 when his team camped within sight of the old Devriox property. He wrote, "Would set our tents on higher ground, maybe 200 yards from the ruined house. The men were tired. Around midnight, one of the Bayou lamps began to swing on its own, no wind to move it. Then came a knock, steady, deliberate, from below us. The earth shivered with each strike. We thought it thunder till the third knock came from under my boots." Montrose's partner refused to return to the site. Within a week, the team had relocated north, leaving their equipment behind. The official project logs list unfavorable ground conditions as the reason for withdrawal. It was in this same year that a devastating hurricane struck the Louisiana coast. Floodwaters erased most landmarks south of Houma, and Bayou Dufour was submerged for weeks. When the waters receded, the widow's land was gone, nothing left but a scum of silt and uprooted cypress trunks. Locals said the storm had claimed the last of her. Yet, in the months that followed, fishermen began pulling strange finds from their nets. Bits of brick, glass jars sealed tight with wax, and one peculiar object wrapped in black muslin. The fisherman who opened it, an old man named Toussaint Gaspard, described what he saw to a deputy. A man's hand, shriveled, all white like candle wax, with a gold ring still on it. The deputy confiscated it, and no record of its disposal was ever made. It was after this that the tale of Eulalie Devriox entered what the folklorists would later call La Tradition du Bayou, the oral history of southern Louisiana. Children sang fragments of a rhyme. Widow waits where waters sleep, husband's bones she swore to keep. If you hear her count to 3, run before she counts on thee. The rhyme was recorded by a linguist in 1920, who noted that no one could trace its origin, but the adults of Bayou Dufour claimed it wasn't a rhyme at all, merely a warning disguised as one. In that same year, an aging journalist from New Orleans, Henry Boudrox, revisited the Devriox file while researching the Axeman murders, still haunting public memory. In a column for the Times Democrat, he drew a chilling parallel. The Axeman struck his blows from above, where all could see the ruin. The widow struck hers from below, where no one dares to look. Each left their music behind, the sound of axe and the sound of earth. Boudrox's article reignited the story. Soon, the old site, now a marshy hollow, was visited by curiosity seekers. Most found nothing but cattails and the cries of egrets. A few, however, returned pale and silent, unwilling to speak of what they'd heard. In the following year, 1916, The bayou froze over for the first time in memory. Hunters reported cracks in the ice forming in perfect circles, centered exactly where the Devrock's home once stood. When the bayou froze in 1916, a rare event even in the coldest winters, old residents said it was a sign that something beneath the water had finally gone still. The cypress trees stood stiff as grave markers, and the surface glittered like a tarnished mirror. For weeks, no bird sang. Then, one morning in late January, the ice cracked with a sound that echoed clear across Terrebonne Parish. By afternoon, a hunter named Paul Danton came into Houma with a story that seemed to revive the entire legend. He claimed to have seen, beneath the melting ice, the faint outline of a staircase. Not a shadow, he insisted in his affidavit, but steps, neat and even, leading down into the water. The parish constable dismissed it as frost fractures. Still, word spread quickly, and within days small groups of men began visiting the site with shovels and lanterns. One of them, Thomas Valery, a blacksmith's apprentice, wrote a letter home to his mother on February 4th. "Why I found the corner of a brick wall today. The mud's soft, like the ground won't hold us. Every time I dig, water fills the hole as if it's bleeding. But the strangest thing, there's air under there. Warm air, rising through the cracks." 2 days later, a flood swept through the lower parish, submerging the area once again. By the time the water retreated, nothing remained of their digging but a single timber beam poking from the mud. Valery was never seen again. The following spring brought government engineers to the region, mapping levee improvements. Their report, dry, bureaucratic, but chilling in hindsight, mentions a subterranean cavity of unknown depth near the old Devrock's coordinates. One engineer, W.L. Pritchard, included a sketch showing concentric rings in the soil strata, as if the ground had been hollowed in layers. He wrote, "Structure appears deliberate, possibly hand-dug. Air escaping carries a faint organic odor. Locals didn't need a report to know what it meant. They said the widow's cellar had never closed, that the lime and clay had merely formed a lid too thin to hold her secrets." When the earth shifted, her keeping place breathed again. Around this time, Reverend Price, by then an old man living in New Orleans, gave a recorded sermon preserved on a wax cylinder, discovered much later in the Tulane archives. His words were cracked with age, but one line stands clear: the widow was not alone in her keeping. There are many who cannot bear to let the dead lie quiet. He mentioned, briefly, the axemen of New Orleans, whose murders had just begun to terrify the city. Price suggested that evil, once unearthed, moves from host to host like a fever, an inheritance no confession can cleanse. The widow's silence, he said, was only the first note. That sermon would be his last. He died weeks later, his body found seated upright in his study, the cylinder still spinning beside him. Some claim to have heard faint knocking in the background of the recording, though archivists attribute it to damage. By 1918, the Devrock site was once again invisible, claimed entirely by the bayou's shifting waters. Fishermen called it Le Trou de la Veuve, the widow's hole. They said no bait sank there, no net drew anything up. Even the currents avoided that patch of water. And yet, when the wind was still and the moon rode high, a few swore they could see bubbles rise in even intervals, 3 at a time, each breaking the surface with a small, hollow pop, as if something below were quietly counting. By the early 1920s, the widow Devrock's story had become something between a warning and a wager. Young men in Houma or Thibodaux would boast over whiskey that they'd camped near Le Trou de la Veuve and heard nothing, while the older generation would shake their heads, muttering that arrogance invited remembrance. For though the Devrock's house was gone, her cellar, or whatever lay beneath it, was not. The first formal mention of the place after the flood years comes from the Louisiana State Geological Bulletin of 1922, which refers to a depression of unstable earth along the Bayou de Four shelf, with reports of periodic subsidence and gaseous emissions. The authors, unaware or dismissive of local legend, recommended further study but noted that workers refused to remain on site after dusk due to superstitious concerns. The report was quietly archived. What keeps the case unsettling is how small factual traces keep surfacing. In 1923, a trapper named Henry Lemoyne brought to the sheriff's office a glass jar he'd dredged from his eel nets. It was sealed with black wax and contained a piece of cloth, half decayed, embroidered with the initials, E.D. The fabric matched the weave used in late 19th century mourning veils. When the jar was opened, the water inside released a faint scent of lilac, an aroma no one could explain. Lemoyne, after handing it over, left town and was never heard from again. Later that year, a small notice appeared in the Times-Picayune. Strange objects in the Bayou. Parish officials caution against disturbing submerged artifacts near Dufour Creek. Geological team to assess possible contamination. That line, possible contamination, became a convenient excuse for sealing the site off once more. But the truth was simpler. No one wanted to be responsible for what might still lie down there. Folklorists began visiting the parish in the 1920s, collecting what they called swamp testimonies. Among them was Dr. Elaine Pritchard, a field researcher from Baton Rouge who recorded interviews with older residents. One, a midwife named Membery Baptist, described treating the widow in her final year. Her words were transcribed phonetically in Cajun French, but the translation reads, "She said her men would not rot if they stayed close, that the soil took them too fast, so she built a room where the air was cool and the worms stayed out. She told me she could still hear them breathing." That single statement reawakened public fascination. Newspapers once again drew parallels to the unsolved Axeman of New Orleans murders, arguing that both figures represented a sickness of Louisiana's underbelly, born of isolation, heat, and faith unanchored. Academic papers followed, trying to separate myth from record, but most ended in speculation. Around this time, a man claiming to be a descendant of Eulalie's first husband arrived from Baton Rouge. He sought to clear her name, insisting that his ancestor had merely run north to Texas and never returned. He even provided a letter said to prove it. But handwriting experts found the ink inconsistent with the supposed date, and the man disappeared before testifying. Some said he took a boat out to the Bayou at night and never rowed back. By 1924, superstition had reasserted its hold. No one fished near the widow's hole anymore. Hunters swore their dogs grew restless passing that section of marsh. One man, in a statement filed years later, claimed the water there hummed like a throat clearing before speech. That same autumn, a drought lowered the Bayou by nearly 2 feet. Beneath the surface, for the first time in years, the top edge of a brick archway was seen. Round, deliberate, and unmistakably human-made. The brick archway first appeared in October of 1924, exposed by the drought that left Bayou Dufour sluggish and shallow. At dawn, the light caught on its curved rim, slick with moss, and fishermen who spotted it from their skiffs said it looked like a mouth half open, waiting to speak. Within a week, word reached the parish seat. Sheriff LeBlanc, grandson of one of the original deputies who had sealed the cellar in 1908, reluctantly authorized a brief inspection. A small party went out by boat, 2 deputies, a surveyor, and a reporter from the Houma Courier. The reporter's name was Simon Roos, and his account survives in a personal notebook now stored at the Terrebonne Historical Society. He described the arch as formed of red brick, hand-laid, edges smooth, mortar still sound though submerged nearly 20 years. The deputies lowered a rope with a lantern attached. The light vanished after only a few feet, swallowed by black water. Roos noted a smell, like rust and sweetness combined, heavy enough to cling to the throat. They agreed to return the next day with better equipment, but when they arrived, the arch was gone, buried again under fresh silt, as though the Bayou had healed itself overnight. Roos's article never made it to print. His editor deemed it a tale for drunks, not readers. Still, his notebook circulated quietly among locals. On the final page, in handwriting less steady than before, he wrote, "Something moved beneath, not the current. It shifted like a lung." The drought broke soon after. Heavy rains returned, flooding the lowlands. By December, the entire hollow was underwater once more, the arch lost. That same winter, Roos left Louisiana for good, settling in Illinois. In a 1931 letter to a friend, he admitted he still dreamed of that dark opening. "I hear it whispering my name, as if the bayou itself remembers." The reappearance of the archway revived old conversations in Terrebonne Parish. Elders recalled the early accounts. Deputy Hebert's dreams, Reverend Price's breathing cellar, the lime that sank for days after it was poured. It all seemed connected, a rhythm repeating through the decades. The accident of New Orleans was still fresh in collective memory then, his last known murders having ended only a few years before. One professor from Tulane University even proposed a paper linking the two cases as examples of regional psychosis. The idea that isolation and swamp fever bred shared delusions. He suggested the widow was not a killer at all, but a projection of collective guilt over the vanished men who had drowned in the storms. His notes were never published. His research boat capsized during a solo trip to the Dufour marshlands in 1925. Meanwhile, parish folklore shifted again. Now, the widow was said to have become part of the land itself. Children were told that if they touched the bayou water near dusk, she'd pull them down to join the husbands she kept. Old women left sprigs of rosemary and salt near the edge of their docks. An offering or reward, depending on who you asked. By 1926, the marsh had grown over completely. The area once known as Le Trou de la Veuve was now a patch of cypress and black water indistinguishable from the rest. The parish maps marked it simply as unstable ground. But on still nights, hunters claimed they could see faint light glimmering under the surface, slow and steady like a heartbeat, and those who dared to linger swore they heard counting. 1, 2, 3, before the wind rose and the bayou fell silent again. By 1930, the widow of Bayou Dufour had become both a superstition and a warning. Boatmen invoked her name before setting out, half in jest, half in fear. The younger generation, unfamiliar with the case's original details, turned her story into a cautionary rhyme. Widow waits where waters fall. Husbands whisper, one and all. Yet beneath the folklore, a few quiet voices still pursued the truth. One such man was Dr. Felix Arnaud, a professor of criminology at Tulane University who had previously lectured on the accident of New Orleans. Arnaud was fascinated by patterns of regional myth evolving from real crimes, what he called memory surviving evidence. In 1931, he traveled south with two graduate assistants to locate the widow's property, armed with maps, microfilmed newspapers, and copies of 1908 arrest records that never yielded a conviction. According to a surviving field report preserved in the Tulane archives, Arnaud found remnants of foundation stones near what was once the Dufour settlement, 3 flat slabs arranged in a crescent, half buried under reeds. Beneath them, he noted faint impressions of cellar steps carved from brick. His assistants wanted to dig, but Arnaud refused, claiming the earth was too soft to trust. That evening, while camped nearby, they recorded odd fluctuations in air pressure and described faint, metallic knocking from underground. The next morning, Arnaud's tent was empty. His notebook, however, was recovered weeks later by a trapper. The final line read, "The ground breathes here, as if the dead are restless to be counted." His disappearance reignited local unease. Parish newspapers speculated wildly, alligators, sinkholes, or simply misadventure. But none could explain the single set of footprints leading into the marsh, with none returning. The case file closed quietly that spring, marked presumed drowned. Around this same period, a peculiar pattern emerged in the marriage records of Terrebonne Parish. 3 widows, all from nearby bayou towns, filed for property exemptions using the surname Desmarais, the same name once linked to the 1908 widow. Their handwriting varied, yet each application used identical phrasing, claiming protection under conjugal right, husband deceased by natural misfortune. Only one was approved. The other 2 vanished before hearings were held. When the parish clerk mentioned it later to a local reporter, he was told to drop the matter. Too many ghosts in that name, his supervisor warned. The widow, it seemed, had become less a woman than a pattern, an echo reasserting itself through generations. Even the folklore began to warp. Some claimed she was a healer punished for her craft, others that she'd made a pact with the bayou itself. Old Baptists whispered she was a test sent by God. Creole elders countered that she was simply a reminder that the swamp keeps what it's owed. By 1935, a Works Progress Administration project sought to drain part of the marshland to build a narrow road through the area. The construction foreman, Eli Mercer, filed 3 complaints that his workers refused to continue after discovering old glass, human teeth, and fragments of lime brick near the site. One crewman described hearing a woman's humming under the mud. Mercer dismissed it as nerves from heat and drink. But when he attempted to mark the location on his survey map, the paper warped with moisture despite being dry to the touch. That section of the road was never completed. The project was abandoned after a storm destroyed their supply barge. Locals took it as a sign that the widow's ground should remain untouched. Even now, in parish ledgers, that segment of proposed roadway is labeled Segment 13 unbuilt. The number 13 is no coincidence, they say, because by then, 13 men had gone missing within a mile of where her cellar once stood. The year 1937 marked an unexpected return of interest in the widow's legend. Not from locals this time, but from a traveling documentarian named Lyle Hanford, who had come south to record folklore under a small grant from the Federal Writers Project. Hanford's journals describe a restless fascination with the invisible boundary between superstition and record. He arrived in Terrebonne Parish late that summer, interviewing fishermen, gravekeepers, and the elderly who remembered the 1908 scandal only as whispers told by candlelight. Among his interviews was Etta Rousseau, the daughter of the reporter who had once written about the vanished archway. She was 51 then, sharp-minded despite her frailty, and still living in her father's old home near the Bayou. Hanford's typed transcript of their conversation survives in the Louisiana State Archives. She told him, in clipped Creole French, that her father never escaped the thing he'd seen breathing under the water. She believed the archway had not been built by the widow, but for her, an entrance sealed and resealed over time to keep something in, not out. Etta recalled how her father, before his death, had burned all his remaining field notes except one page. On that surviving scrap, the single line read, "The cellar was deeper than the house." But the house was not her first. Hanford was intrigued. He sought parish property deeds from the late 19th century, hoping to trace prior structures on the same site. He found a curious entry from 1874, a small plantation parcel transferred from a family named Duplessis to one Madeleine Desmarais, the same surname as the widow later accused in 1908. No further records appeared for her before or after that sale, suggesting the name may have been an alias even then. Hanford's next step was to locate the exact coordinates of the Duplessis tract. He traveled there with a guide and an assistant in early October, taking his recording equipment, an early wire recorder model, bulky and temperamental. In his last letter to the project director, dated October 11, he wrote, "The water's gone low again. There's a hollow sound when I step on the boards, as if the Bayou remembers its old cellar." Neither Hanford nor his assistant returned. Their skiff was found drifting downstream 3 days later, the wire recorder tangled in the reeds. When played back, the device emitted only static for several minutes. Then a faint rhythmic tapping, like knuckles against wood, followed by a woman's hum. Archivists dismissed it as interference from the motor, but technicians noted that the hum modulated in precise intervals, too deliberate to be mechanical. The disappearance drew brief attention in the New Orleans Item Tribune, but the paper printed only a small column titled, "Writer Lost in Bayou Storm." No mention of the widow. No mention of the cellar. The project soon reassigned Hanford's grant to another researcher. His surviving materials, 4 reels of static, 3 photographs of cypress roots, and a half-written manuscript titled, "The Widow's Geography," remain uncatalogued to this day. Decades later, in 1952, when the flood control levee was extended through Terrebonne Parish, workers dredged part of that same bayou for foundation fill. They unearthed several bricks, oddly symmetrical, stamped with a manufacturer's mark from Lafourche Parish 1870s, the same period as the Duplessis deed. The foreman sent a few samples to the state geological office. The rest were dumped back into the water. The technician's report noted traces of human bone, dust mixed in the mortar. But no official mention was ever made. The record ends there. Abruptly, unsigned, as if the paper itself refused to carry the story any further. The 1950s brought electricity and levees to much of southern Louisiana. Yet the Dufour marshlands remained stubbornly wild. The road projects halted at the edge of standing water, and what lay beyond stayed in the realm of hunters, trappers, and those with long memories. By then, few living souls could recall the widow by name, but they remembered her place. A bend in the bayou where the air turned colder and even mosquitoes thinned out. It was in that same decade that Father Remy Dugas, a priest assigned to St. Catherine's Parish, began collecting local testimonies about unclean ground. His notes, recovered later from parish storage, were intended for an article on regional folklore. Instead, they read like a slow descent into obsession. He'd heard of a stretch of land where nothing grew but gray reeds, where dogs refused to tread. The locals called it La Fosse de la Veuve, the widow's pit. Dugas visited the site in late 1954. In his journal he described a subtle vibration in the soil, like the bayou itself exhaled beneath my boots. He found fragments of brick arranged in a crescent, the same formation noted decades earlier by Doter Arnaud. This time, however, one corner of the crescent had collapsed, revealing what he took for a sinkhole. He lowered a lamp tied to twine. The light descended only a few feet before the twine went slack and the flame vanished, snuffed out, not by wind or water, but something denser. Dugas left the site shaken. In his next sermon, he warned his congregation about tempting the ground where the past still breathes. Parishioners assumed he spoke metaphorically, but those closest to him later said he couldn't sleep. One night he told his housekeeper, "I keep hearing counting in the walls, like someone measuring the dead." A week later, he resigned his post and disappeared. In 1956, a fisherman found a wooden crucifix tangled in the reeds near the widow's marsh. It bore Father Dugas's initials. No body was recovered. The diocese sealed his notes and labeled them delirium unverified phenomena. Through the following years, stories spread quietly among Bayou residents. Some said Dugas had unearthed a second entrance to the widow's cellar. Others claimed his lantern had reached what no one else's ever did. The chamber itself. Rumors insisted the cellar was not a simple room, but a series of steps descending into something older, something that predated any house or map. It was around this time that an article in the Times-Picayune drew parallels between the widow legend and the forgotten violence of the early 20th century, mentioning again the axemen of New Orleans as a cultural echo of fear and fascination with hidden crimes. The journalist suggested that both the axeman and the widow reflected the psychological geography of the South, where guilt sinks and never dries. But outside academic circles, the story persisted in simpler terms. The widow had married 7 men, they said, and kept each one below until the ground refused to hold another. Children dared one another to walk near the old bend at night. Hunters avoided it entirely. Even in daylight, there was a sense of quiet too complete, like the world holding its breath. By 1959, state engineers surveying the area for a new canal noted an anomalous depression, roughly where Dugas had last stood. They drilled to test soil density. At 10 feet, the drill bit struck something hollow. Within seconds, the ground began to shift. The crew pulled back in time to see the surface collapse, forming a perfect circle about 6 feet wide. Water poured in, and within minutes, the hole was gone. The foreman marked the site on his chart. In the margin, he wrote 3 words, perhaps a warning, perhaps a confession. She's still below. When the 1960s came, Louisiana was changing, roads, oil rigs, and modern lights creeping into places once ruled by cypress shadow. But the Bayou still had its secret heart, and for those who knew its older names, the legend of the widow never truly slept. By then, it had passed beyond family memory into folklore, yet strange entries in police ledgers suggested that whatever haunted those waters continued to breathe in its own slow rhythm. In 1961, a small oil exploration team, working under the Laforge Drilling Company, reported a catastrophic equipment failure near a swamp corridor adjacent to Bayou du Fort. The company's statement blamed methane pockets, but the private notes of their field engineer, Warren Cormier, told another story. His recovered logbook, now held in a private collection, contained sketches of the drill site, beside a rough map of the bayou he had written. Cavity below, sound like wind through teeth. 2 days later, Cormier and one assistant went missing. Search parties found their boat moored to a cypress trunk, engine cold. In the hole lay a single oil lantern, half burned, its wick still damp. No bodies, no footprints, only faint indentations in the soft mud, round deep as if pressed by bare heels. The parish sheriff ruled them lost to the swamp, but the locals whispered otherwise. One old trapper swore he'd seen a woman in black walking the reeds, head bowed, carrying something like a shovel. That winter, storms rolled through the region, flooding much of Terrebonne Parish. When the water receded months later, a new channel had formed, slicing directly through what had once been the Duplessis Tract, the widow's suspected land. Locals began calling it La Fente, the split. It was narrow but unnaturally straight, as if carved rather than eroded. Fishermen said their nets snagged on brick, not rock, and one diver, testing a new motorized air pump, reported touching cold iron rings set deep in the submerged soil. In 1964, a Tulane folklore student named Margaret Lenoir visited the area while researching ghost traditions of southern Louisiana. She interviewed elderly residents, including the widow of the last Dufour postmaster. The old woman, half blind and soft-spoken, told her, "The cellar's still there. It moves with the rain. You can bury something in one parish and it'll rise in another." Lenoir recorded over 6 hours of testimony, fragments of memory bound by fear. Days later, she wrote in her research diary, "Every witness mentions humming. They don't agree on pitch, only that it comes from below." She never submitted her thesis. Her professor received her recorder in the mail, returned postage marked from Homa, but the tape was blank. Lenoir herself disappeared on her drive home. Her car was later found submerged off a levee near Bayou du Fort, windows rolled down, keys still in ignition, no signs of struggle. By the decade's end, the area had been officially declared unstable wetland, unfit for habitation. Still, hunters told of hearing soft singing on foggy mornings. Some swore they'd glimpsed the outline of a house beneath the water's surface. Roof slanted, walls intact, before the current swallowed it again. It was around this same time that a regional historian, writing about forgotten crimes of the early South, revisited the Axemen of New Orleans case. In a brief footnote, he mentioned, or another terror, feminine in form, that preceded the Axemen's mania. A woman who buried her secrets in lime and silence. He did not name her, but anyone who grew up near Bayou du Fort knew exactly who he meant, because the Bayou never forgets what it's been fed. By the early 1970s, the widow had slipped from living memory into campfire legend. Her name appeared in children's dares, whispered in half-sung rhymes around fishing docks. Yet beneath the myth, something persistent lingered. An undertone in parish records, strange disappearances that kept aligning with the same coordinates. In 1972, the Louisiana Geological Survey initiated a minor study of sinkholes forming along Bayou du Fort. Field technician Alan Pierce led the effort, compiling core samples and hydrograph readings. He had no interest in ghost stories, only data, but his notes, still preserved in a cracked leather log, carry a tone that shifts from scientific precision to unease. His first entry reads plainly, groundwater saturation higher than projected, brackish odor. The final one, dated October 17th, ends with a single line. I heard them counting. Pierce and his assistant vanished 2 days later. The search team found their equipment, lanterns extinguished, survey rods bent in half as if twisted by enormous pressure. Their jeep was still parked on the levee, doors open, radio hissing faint static that rose and fell like breathing. Officials blamed quicksand collapse, but the bodies were never found. That same year, local preacher Reverend Jonas Duperret, who ministered to fishing families along the Bayou, began documenting what he called Resurgences of the widow's name. Parishioners confessed dreams of being buried in cold earth, hearing a woman's song just beyond the ceiling. One man claimed his wife woke each night at 3:03 a.m., always the same minute, saying she heard footsteps descending wooden stairs. They lived miles from any basement. Dupré compiled his notes into a small tract titled, "The Swamp Remembers Its Dead," printed privately in 1974. In it, he wrote, "It is not the ghost that returns, but the debt. Each generation pays what the last could not bear to face." The tract was pulled from circulation after the diocese protested its occult implications. But copies circulated quietly, and one found its way to the Louisiana Folklife Project, which in 1975 sent two researchers, Carla Venn and Raymond Blanchard, to record oral histories. Their tapes still exist, though half the audio is lost to humidity. In the surviving minutes, an elderly trapper describes seeing a light deep under the water, like a lamp through glass, and something he called the widow's breath, a ripple that moved against the current. In his last interview before his death, Blanchard confessed to colleagues that he felt a pressure in the air near the old Dufour Bend, as though the swamp itself leaned close to listen. Venn later described waking one night to faint tapping from the hotel floorboards beneath her bed. 3 knocks. Pause, 3 more, like a pattern being counted. After their report, the Folklife Project discontinued research in Terrebonne Parish, citing safety concerns, but not before one chilling observation in their conclusion. There is reason to believe the folklore surrounding the widow may have originated from an actual burial site, repeatedly uncovered and reabsorbed by Bayou movement. The recurring brick, iron, and lime fragments suggest human design rather than geological anomaly. The report's final page carries a handwritten note in the margin, uncertain in tone. If she was real, she was never alone. From then on, the legend quieted. The swamp swallowed its own story again. The new generation spoke of oil leases, not ghosts, of politics, not prayers. But every few years, a fisherman still went missing near that same bend. Their names joined an invisible ledger, one only the Bayou seemed to keep, and those who lived nearby learned to leave offerings, salt, rosemary, or a single white candle beside the water at dusk, not to summon, only to remind. By the 1980s, Bayou Dufour had become a near, forgotten stretch of green, black water, bypassed by highways and left out of tourist maps. The modern world was swallowing the old Louisiana one bayou at a time, yet this piece of land resisted. It remained half drowned, half dreaming, a pocket of the past. The few who still lived along its margins called it La Dormeuse, the sleeper. In 1982, a survey drone, one of the first small aerial units used by state engineers, captured something uncanny. When the film was developed, one frame showed a circular depression bordered by discolored reeds. In the middle, faint geometric outlines were visible, a rectangle, then a smaller one inside it, perfectly centered. Analysts assumed it to be an old foundation revealed by drought. But one technician, James Robidoux, noted something odd. Every subsequent aerial taken that month showed the reeds in normal formation, no depression at all. Robidoux, curious and stubborn, drove out there himself on a weekend with a canoe. He marked the coordinates and found the spot easily enough. But what he described later to a friend was not quite land, not quite water. He pushed through muck until his paddle struck something hard. Brick, smooth, precise. When he leaned closer, he saw a circle of iron emerging from the mud. Thinking it a well cap, he brushed it clean with his hand. Beneath the rust, an engraving surfaced: M. Desmarais, 1874. That was the last anyone heard from Robidoux. His canoe was found adrift the next morning, his camera still in its waterproof case. The film contained 3 photographs, 2 of cypress trees, and one half-blurred image of what looked like an opening in the water, reflecting light even though the sky was overcast. The state filed his death as an accidental drowning, but the technicians who developed his negatives refused to work in the lab after dark for several weeks. Around this same time, a local historian named Evangeline Brassard published a pamphlet titled "Woman Who Vanished: Forgotten Crimes of the Bayou." In one brief section, She revisited the widow case, referencing both 1908 records and later disappearances, including Hanford, Arnaud, and Dugas. Brossard drew a chilling line through them all, suggesting that the phenomenon might represent persistence of pattern, a territorial haunting manifest through recurrence. She noted the strange consistency. Every investigation, no matter the decade, ended in disappearance or silence, and though her tone was academic, she ended her essay with a line that felt more like prayer than scholarship. If her cellar still breathes, it is not to hold but to wait. Locals remember that Brossard herself visited Bayou du Fort soon after the pamphlet's release, determined to map the precise boundaries of the old Duplessis tract. She went alone, armed with a compass, a waterproof notebook, and a revolver she kept in her glove compartment. When a hunter discovered her abandoned car 3 days later, the driver's door was open, her umbrella resting neatly on the seat. Inside the glove box, he found a folded page torn from her notebook. In it she'd written, "I heard 3 knocks. It wasn't rain." The rest of her notes were never recovered. By 1989, satellite mapping of southern Louisiana showed subtle elevation shifts in the Dufour marshlands, patterns resembling steps or ridges. Surveyors dismissed them as compression artifacts caused by decaying peat. But those who knew the stories said otherwise. They said the cellar was rising again, reshaping itself beneath the silt, calling to anyone curious enough to listen. And late that year, during a dry season when the water ran lower than memory, fishermen reported hearing something from beneath the bayou. A hollow echo, rhythmic, as if someone far below was knocking once more to be found. The 1990s brought development, pipelines, and survey teams, but in the heart of the Dufour marsh, time still dragged like silt. By then, most thought the widow a folktale, one of those regional superstitions folded into Louisiana's humid folklore alongside Rougarous and river witches. Yet even the most pragmatic oil men admitted there was something wrong with that particular tract. Machinery broke more often there, compasses spun without cause, radios hissed with a sound like shallow breathing. In 1993, a petroleum company called Baystar Resources began drilling exploratory wells just east of the old widow's grounds. A subcontractor's report, since redacted, survived in fragments after being leaked years later. It describes an anomalous void, detected beneath 30 feet of solid clay, roughly 8 by 12 feet in dimension. When the drill head breached it, the pressure readings dropped sharply, as if the chamber had inhaled. Seconds later, the entire borehole collapsed. 2 men were injured. One, a veteran geologist named Frank Odom, told a field nurse afterward, "It wasn't a void. It was waiting." Odom refused to work another day and moved his family to Arkansas. Within a month, he vanished from a rest stop while driving north. His truck was found still idling, headlights on, doors open. A witness claimed to have seen a woman in dark clothing near the highway median moments before. When investigators reviewed the well site footage from that day, they found a single corrupted frame. For 1 second, the video showed what looked like brick arching beneath the ground, illuminated by floodlights. The image flickered, then returned to static. Engineers blamed a feedback artifact. But the timestamp on that frame was 3:03 p.m., the same minute locals later recalled, when Reverend Dupre's parishioner said she'd heard footsteps descending invisible stairs 20 years before. The drilling project was abandoned. Baystar wrote off the site as geologically unstable, citing sinkhole risk. But for years afterward, the local Cajun families refused to fish or even cross that stretch of water. The bayou had earned a new name among them, Les Soffel de la Veuve, the widow's breath. They said the air above it always seemed to pulse, faintly, like the chest of something sleeping. Around this time, folklorist Hannah Keene of Louisiana State University published a paper exploring parallels between urban legends and topographic memory, how trauma attaches to land. She included a footnote referencing an old Terrebonne account of a widow's cellar rumored to exhale marsh gas and song. Keene, skeptical by training, dismissed the legend as a metaphor for subsidence and methane release. Still, she admitted to colleagues that during her site visit, she'd felt pressure in the soles of her feet, as though something beneath the soil was shifting. 2 weeks after her return to Baton Rouge, Keene suffered a breakdown during a guest lecture. Witnesses said she froze mid-sentence, staring at the floor, whispering, "It's still counting." She left academia soon after, disappearing into seclusion. Her students preserved her field tape, though the last minute is distorted. A faint melody can be heard under the static, a woman's low hum, looping, steady. By the end of the decade, the Dufour Marsh was sealed off entirely under state conservation orders. Officially, it was to protect wetland habitat. Unofficially, surveyors refused to enter. Their instruments malfunctioned, and one team swore they saw a light moving under the water like a lantern. No further excavations were permitted, and so the ground lay quiet again, at least on the surface. But old fishermen said the bayou's heartbeat had grown stronger, its breaths deeper, as though whatever had been kept below was almost ready to rise. By the early 2000s, the last of the Dufour Parish elders had passed, taking with them most of the oral records of the widow's story. Yet a few boxes of papers remained locked in the attic of the defunct Terrebonne courthouse. Brittle maps, water-stained affidavits, and a small folio marked Private A.D. 1910. The folio was rediscovered during an archival reorganization in 2004 by a graduate researcher named Evelyn Mott, who was tracing patterns of unexplained disappearances across early 20th century Louisiana. Inside were 13 sheets of onion skin paper written in a slanted, feminine hand. There was no signature, but the tone was unmistakable. The writer spoke of men who forget themselves in my keeping, of their warmth keeping the earth from closing in. The last page simply read, "Hay will not go cold tonight. The house remembers him." Evelyn brought her findings to the LSU Historical Review, which published a short note under the title, "Possible Confession Fragment from the Dufour Widow, ca. 1908. It caused a brief sensation in local circles, but was dismissed by most historians as a forgery, perhaps the work of a morbid admirer who had encountered the earlier newspaper myths. Yet the handwriting analysis, conducted quietly by a state archivist, revealed unsettling similarities between the folio and the known correspondence of Clay Mentz Arnaud, the very widow rumored to have lived on that cursed stretch of bayou. Evelyn became obsessed with verifying the paper's provenance. She retraced every reference from the 1908 Times-Picayune article to the coroner's ledger stored in Baton Rouge. In her notebook she wrote, "Every record ends at the cellar. None explains what was found in it, only that it was sealed again." In May 2006, Evelyn drove south to see the site for herself, carrying only a lantern, a camera, and a copy of Keene's field notes. The warden at the conservation office remembered her as quiet but determined. She signed the visitor log at 7:42 a.m. and never returned. Her rental car was later discovered near an embankment, the front tires sunk into soft earth, headlights dimmed, engine off. Inside was her recorder. On the final tape, timestamped 18:19 a.m., Evelyn can be heard trudging through shallow water, breathing heavily, muttering about finding the brick line. Then, in the background, something begins to hum. Low, almost musical, but rising in pitch. She stops walking. There's a brief silence before she whispers, "I thought you were gone." After that, static. Authorities searched for 6 days but found nothing. No footprints beyond a few disturbed reeds, no sign of struggle, no body. Yet when they reviewed aerial photographs of the area taken during the search, analysts noticed a faint geometric pattern under the murky water, a rectangular outline where no foundation should have been. They said it looked like a cellar, its roof just beneath the surface. The case was ruled accidental disappearance due to disorientation and environmental hazards. But the warden later told a reporter that at night, he often heard a woman's hum floating over the marsh, accompanied by a rhythmic bubbling from below, as if the bayou itself were exhaling. By then, the name Clay Mentz Arnaud had long faded from public memory. Yet in old parish registers, her handwriting still lingered. In birth entries, marriage certificates, funeral records, delicate loops of ink connecting her to dozens of men across 2 decades. All of them signed, all of them vanished, and every signature ended the same way, with a faint downward flourish, as if trailing off into the ground itself. By 2012, the story of the widow had become an uneasy curiosity among Louisiana's paranormal researchers. A case too strange to dismiss, yet too fragmented to prove. One of these researchers, Dr. Julian Mercier, a retired anthropologist from Tulane University, began compiling what he called the Bayou Confession Dossier. He collected every document: the missing constable's report from 1909, the coroner's illegible notes, Evelyn Mott's tape transcript, even weather logs showing inexplicable temperature dips over the marsh on the anniversaries of the disappearances. Mercier's goal wasn't to prove the supernatural, but to trace how grief solidifies into geography. In interviews, he compared the case to the Axemen of New Orleans, that same era of fear and newspaper sensationalism that blurred fact into legend. He noted that while the Axemen's crimes ended abruptly, the widow's tale seemed to persist, like a note sustained by the land itself. In 2013, Mercier visited the Dufour Conservation Tract under state permit, hoping to take soil and gas samples. The rangers warned him that the area flooded unpredictably, even GPS devices often malfunctioned. He recorded in his journal that the ground there felt hollow in parts, as though the earth were breathing beneath his boots. When he struck a patch of clay with his trowel, he heard a deep metallic tone. He thought it might be an old storm drain, but the ranger with him claimed there were no utilities within miles. Later that night, Mercier camped near the edge of the marsh, writing by lantern light. His last note, dated April 4th, reads, "The hum again. Faint, steady under the mud. I think it follows the water table." The next morning, the ranger found his tent empty. His field camera lay nearby, its film ruined by exposure to moisture. Only one frame was salvageable: the corner of a stone arch, faintly illuminated by lamplight, disappearing into blackness. Mercier's disappearance reignited local fascination. News outlets briefly covered it, framing the story as the curse of the widow's cellar. But for those in Dufour Parish, it wasn't entertainment. Locals began reporting disturbances again. Sounds of shovels at night, lanterns bobbing beneath the fog, and the same humming that once haunted Keene and Evelyn. An elderly man named Jules Robicheaux, who'd lived his entire life along the Bayou, told a Baton Rouge journalist, "It's not her that walks, it's them. They never found peace because she kept them too long." He described dreams of men standing in water up to their chests, their mouths open but no sound coming out. In an eerie parallel, weather instruments at a nearby environmental station recorded microtremors beneath the marsh every evening, just before midnight. A low, repetitive pulse. Geologists blamed tidal resonance, yet one technician wrote anonymously to the Terrebonne Herald, saying the readings were too regular, too deliberate. By autumn of that year, the state quietly reclassified the Dufour Tract as a restricted hydrological site. No public access was permitted. The few who have skirted its boundaries since describe an almost physical quiet. No frogs, no insects, no wind. One hiker said it felt like standing inside someone's held breath. Still, the legend refuses to die. Amateur radio operators claim that if you tune between frequencies near the marsh after dark, you can pick up a woman's voice. Faint, rhythmic, whispering in French, "Elles dorment toujours." They are still sleeping. Perhaps in some way she is right. The cellar was sealed, but what it held was never buried deep enough. Even now, more than a century after the first whispers about the widow of the Dufour Marsh, her name moves through Louisiana's folklore like a submerged current. Never visible, yet impossible to drain away. The Bayou has reclaimed the land where her house once stood, yet the soil still remembers. Locals say that if you push a stick into the mud on the right moonless night, it comes up warm, as though the ground itself were keeping watch. The last official mention of the case appeared in a 2016 article in the Louisiana Historical Quarterly titled, "Domestic Myths of the Bayou South." The author, a cultural historian named Dr. Annette Lejeune, revisited the Dufour legend as part of a broader study on isolation, frontier psychology, and what she called the feminine geography of grief. Lejeune compared the widow's alleged crimes to the folklore that emerged around disasters like the 1908 Louisiana hurricane, when isolation, superstition, and tragedy blurred into one indistinguishable story. She wrote, "Perhaps the widow was not one woman, but the sum of many widows, those who buried their loves under water and let the marsh keep the secret." But Lejeune's paper did not end in dismissal. In her closing note, she admitted that, during a brief field visit to Dufour Parish, she'd found something unexpected, a fragment of brick protruding from the embankment scorched on one side. Nearby, she claimed, the earth exhaled a thin, metallic smell, faintly sweet, like rust mixed with perfume. Her colleagues later confirmed that the brick's composition matched the local clay kilns used in 1890's Terrebonne. That detail alone was unremarkable. What troubled them was that when they returned to the site 2 weeks later to retrieve the sample, the bank had collapsed into the bayou. The brick was gone. Around that same time, a fisherman named Raymond Brassard, one of the last who still ventured near those waters, reported snagging his net on something heavy and square. When he pulled it loose, the ropes came up shredded, as if they'd been cut from below. He swore he heard a low hum traveling through the hull of his boat. He left his catch to rot on the bank and never fished again. Locals say the widow still claims visitors, but not by apparition or scream. Instead, they vanish quietly, into fog, into the pull of the water, into stories half told over campfires. The marsh gives no bones, only breath. The old road that once led to her house has long since drowned under cypress roots, but the air above it carries a peculiar calm. On some nights, when the mist lies low, people walking the levee report the faintest scent of lilac and candle smoke, just before a cold breeze moves across the reeds. It never lasts more than a minute, yet it leaves them uneasy, unsure whether they've stepped into history or been noticed by it. As the years pass, the state archives continue to lose fragments of the widow's record. Pages gone missing, catalog entries erased. Some call it clerical decay. Others believe the story resists being written, as though the land itself edits out whatever truths come too close. And so the cellar remains sealed, the marsh undisturbed. The widow's name is barely remembered, her house erased from maps, her victims uncounted. But if you stand by the water at dusk, when the cicadas go silent and the air holds its breath, you might hear it, a single hum beneath the mud, steady and deep. Not a song, not a warning. Just the earth, remembering what it was made to keep.